Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy New Year. It is 2025. Our show today is going to showcase some of the best interviews we did in the previous year, 2024. As always, we so appreciate our viewers who keep watching. We hope you enjoy these interviews, and we will be back with fresh new content tomorrow. See you then. '24 Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. testified on Capitol Hill today in the House Judiciary Select Subcommittee for the Weaponization of the Federal Government hearing. Democratic lawmakers on the committee blasted Kennedy as he testified about censorship, tech companies, and free speech. In fact, here's some of Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz actually trying to stop Kennedy's testimony as this whole thing was ongoing. Let's watch some of that.
11, Clause 2. Which Mr. Kennedy is violative of, I move that we remove into executive session because Mr. Kennedy has repeatedly made despicable anti-Semitic and anti-Asian comments as recently as last week. Rule 11, Clause 2 says, whenever it is asserted by a member of the committee that the evidence or testimony at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person, or it is asserted by a witness that the evidence or testimony that the witness would give at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate the witness, and it goes on. Mr. Kennedy, among many other things, has said, I know a lot now about bioweapons. We put out hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there is an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are...
Is a lady making a motion or a speech?
I've made a motion to move into executive session because Mr. Kennedy's testimony...
Mr. Chairman, I
and
move
his
to table the
previous
motion.
statements.
Meanwhile, Republican Chairman Jim Jordan tweeted in response, Democrats are attempting to censor speech during a censorship hearing. Can't make it up.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. joins Brianna and I here in the studio right now to discuss. Mr. Kennedy, welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me back.
So you testified today about social media censorship, some of it done at the federal government's behest. And as that was happening, right at the start, members of the federal government actually tried to prevent you from speaking. What did you make of that paradigm happening, unfolding in real time on the very issue you were there to talk about?
You know, I was censored. You know, Judge Doty's decision was released 2 weeks ago. It was an extraordinary 155-page decision by a federal district judge enjoining the federal government from censoring anymore, from colluding with social media. In fact, Judge Doty asked the White House to have no more contact with any of the social media sites because of the magnitude of the censorship. I was in Judge Doty's decision. He mentions that I was the first one that President Biden tried to censor 2 days after he was sworn in. White House officials contacted Facebook and asked them to take down my site, which they did, take down my platform, which they did. They took down my entire Instagram site with 900,000 people, and I had no misinformation on there. They had to make up a new term called malinformation, and that means information that is true but nonetheless offensive to federal policies. So for a long time, I was being censored both by the Trump administration and by the Biden administration. Once I declared for president, it became more difficult. So now they've started this slander offensive against me to silence me. This was extraordinary because it was a meeting, it was a hearing on censorship. And number one, 102 Democrats signed a letter asking that I not be allowed to talk. And when I got there, the Democrats, each of them, listed all these slanders, all of which are untrue. I've never made an anti-Semitic comment in my life, and I said that under oath, or a racist comment not once in my life. I have a better position on Israel than anybody on that committee and anybody in that chamber. I'm the only one who's asked that President Biden revoke the $2 billion that he's sending to Iran. Oh, but they listed all these libels, and then they would not allow me to reply. So they literally made every effort possible to make sure that I couldn't talk. And, the issues that I'm talking about are issues that are of great concern to American people, not only the First Amendment, but the economic issues, the destruction of the middle class. But we need to be able to talk about those things. And this is what I said to the committee. We're a democracy. The free flow of information is the sunlight, it's the water, it's the fertilizer for democracy. We are riven now by this kind of polarization of name calling and hatred and vitriol and marginalization, and we somehow need to start talking to each other again in a way that's gentle, that's kind, that's dignified, respectful, and understanding.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about that because I think it was anticipated that the Democrats were going to have the response to you that they had going into this hearing. There were a number of statements that were made over the course of the last week or so that seemed to foreground the idea that they were going to focus on your statements that they characterized as anti-Semitic and avoid the substance of the censorship issues that you were there to talk about. And I wonder what you make of the situation that you're in, where you're running in the Democratic Party. And ostensibly moments like this, hearings like this, are opportunities to bring the priorities that you care about, like censorship, to the public, where they've been siloed for recent history over in a lot of alternative and right-leaning sites. If Democratic electeds are going to have this kind of response to you in a hearing like this, have you thought about strategically how you plan to help Democratic voters prioritize issues like censorship and like some of the other environmental concerns, some of the COVID mandate vaccine concerns that you've raised and which have been very popular in alternative media?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I clearly have the DNC against me. And, it's not a coincidence that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was leading the kind of battle against me, and she's the same individual who was charged with corruption for getting Bernie, who was leading and almost certainly would have won.
Right.
And she led the DNC's efforts to exclude him from the race. So I was not surprised about her attitude toward me. I'm hoping that, Bernie found an audience, despite the fact that the entire power structure was against him. And I think I have even an advantage on what Bernie Sanders had, because that was before there were podcasts, and that was, he didn't really have the ability to talk to large amounts of grassroots rank and file Democrats. And I'm hoping that that will give me a path into the voters in the primary, despite the fact that the DNC is trying to shut me down.
I want to give you a chance to answer the criticism you got from those comments you made a week ago at the dinner, where you said there's an argument that COVID was engineered as a weapon to ethnically target different races, and you referenced a study that showed this one study that showed that one of the receptors for COVID not being present in the disease for Ashkenazi Jews, and then were criticized that was an anti-Semitic finding. And I've heard some people in the scientific community say, well, that even if that is true of the science, that the COVID doesn't have that receptor, it doesn't necessarily mean that category of Jewish people would be less affected. And also, we don't have evidence that it's a theory that it was engineered as a bioweapon. I mean, we're still arguing about whether I think there's a lot of evidence it could have come from a lab, but we still haven't even settled that question, let alone whether it was engineered on purpose. So how do you respond to those criticisms?
My statement, you made a pretty good synopsis of my statement. I did not say that it was that COVID was. I certainly didn't say it was engineered to target certain races. What I did say is that the United States, China, and Russia are putting large amounts of money into ethnic bioweapons. And then I pointed to an NIH-funded paper, actually a series of papers between 2019 and 2021, that showed that receptor sites on the, as you say, the docking site on the furin cleave is compatible with the ACE2 receptors in the lungs of certain races, people of African descent, most of all Caucasians, and then there's a series of people, ethnic Chinese, one of the least, and a number of other races, including Amish. And with the most incompatible being, in other words, the most protected being Finns, people from Finland. Now, I never suggested that in the real world that the infection infected those people more or less. And I never suggested that it was engineered deliberately by anybody to achieve that effect. There are many, many viruses that have disproportionate effect on races. what the significance to me was as a kind of proof of concept that this is something that bioweapons engineers would pursue. And that's all. I certainly did not mean that. It was never intended, never entered my mind that it was engineered deliberately to protect Jews and injure other people.
Yeah, there's something about one of the statements that Stacey Plaskett, a representative from the Virgin Islands, made at the hearing today, where she was speaking critically of the idea of talking about COVID disproportionately affecting Black people in particular, when many of us remember earlier in the pandemic, a lot of sensitive conversations around the fact that instances like the Tuskegee experiment and other bad interactions between the Black community in the United States and the medical institutions that we have created, I think, legitimate skepticism among Black people who were considering whether or not to get vaccinated. So at an earlier time in the pandemic, it seemed like the progressive, dare I say, woke thing to talk about, which is how to encourage Black people, despite this legitimate concern they have, to go ahead and get vaccinated. And at today's hearing, it seemed like that was flipped on its head somewhat, whereas talking about the fact of there being any disproportionate consequences or outcomes in various populations was evidence of a kind of racism. I mean, what do you make of how your statements have been characterized, arguably mischaracterized in this context by Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, my statements have been consistently, as I said, I mean, I've never made an anti-Semitic statement in my life, but I do talk about the science. The studies that I mentioned just now were funded by NIH. They were done by scientists at the Cleveland Clinic. They were published, one of them was published in a really high-impact, high-gravitas journal. I think it's UBC Medical, which is the top 10 journals in the country. So I was just talking about the science. I wasn't trying to put interpretations on it. The interesting thing is that Blacks did die disproportionately during COVID. But I doubt if it was because of the virulence of anything to do with the virus. I think it was more the disparities in medical care in Black neighborhoods, and also the levels of chronic disease in American Blacks. For example, Blacks were dying in our country at a rate of 3,000 people per million population. In Haiti, which is a poor country, we were told the poor countries were going to be devastated. They had a 1%, about 1.3% vaccination rate, so almost nobody was vaccinated. And they were dying at a rate of 14 people per million population, so 1/200th of our death rate. The same in Nigeria. The average in Africa was about 320 per million population. That's 1/10 of what we had here. So it's unclear. These are all things that need to be studied. But I never believed that it was because I think it's unlikely that it's because the virus is more virulent towards Africans.
Could those discrepancies, those differences in the lethality of COVID be attributed to different
yes.
ages of the population? Yes. I don't know exactly, but the
yes.
average age in Haiti is probably younger than here and things like that.
Yeah, yes, there are many other covariables. And it's interesting. I mean, these are things that should be studied. So I don't think you can make any conclusion from them. But for example, Japan, which has the oldest population in the world, had a death rate about 1/10 the United States. So, these are things. NIH is a $42 billion annual budget. We ought to be looking at that and saying, why are some people surviving? Is it because they took ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in this country? What are the protocols? What are the other differences, so that the next time we have a disease like this, that we actually have some knowledge about it. But those kind of the real questions that you'd want answered are not studied, and that is frustrating.
Do you think there's, they talk about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. I've looked at a lot of the studies. It seems pretty mixed to me. I haven't seen a lot of compelling evidence that they did a lot of good. I've seen one argument that ivermectin, which can help you if you have a parasitic infection. Well, if you study the countries where that's more prevalent, where they did a lot of the ivermectin studies, there was a good outcome, but it wasn't because it was fighting. It was making it easier for you to recover from COVID if you also had a parasitic infection at the same time. So I wonder if there's a skew on the slight positive that have you heard this argument before? So it wouldn't help you in the U.S. because there's not widespread parasitic infections.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked very, very carefully at the studies. There's now, in fact, I just did an article this week. There are now 100 studies that show that ivermectin had profound benefits, generally speaking, a 70 to 85% reduction in hospitalizations and deaths. It was really a miracle drug, particularly in the later pandemic.
But I'm saying if that was all in like Bangladesh or South America, it could be because
it was all over the world.
Off parasites.
It was all over the world. The countries where they use it for parasites, Nigeria, which has the highest river blindness burden in the world, did have the lowest COVID death rate in the world. They use both. They also have the biggest malaria burden, so virtually the entire population is on hydroxychloroquine, and a large part of the population is on ivermectin for river blindness. So, and they had almost no vaccination. They had, I think, something like 1.3% vaccination. So they did very well. But there are states in India, sort of side-by-side states, like Kerala and Uttar Pradesh, where Kerala used our protocol and had the same comparable death rates, and Uttar Pradesh used ivermectin hydroxychloroquine and ended the pandemic overnight. But there's also, if you go in the literature, and there's a doctor called Merrill Nass who has assembled a lot of these, so that you can go on her website and see them, or Harvey Reish, who's the Yale epidemiologist, has also assembled them. There's 400 studies that show benefits from hydroxychloroquine, over almost 100 studies, I think 99, that show extreme benefits, like devastating benefits of ivermectin. And there's a handful of studies that are government-produced, WHO-produced, financed by Bill Gates, that say that there was no benefit, but those studies have a lot of problems.
Well, Mr. Kennedy, I want to change gears a little bit and go back to something you said earlier, I think, in response to our first question, which is that you bristled at the accusations of anti-Semitism in part because you have the best record on Israel, or the best position on Israel as compared to other people in the field or other people in the room or what have you. And I wanted to raise this concern, I think, that a lot of folks on the left who are interested in your campaign have, which is that what is considered broadly in American discourse and among the Democratic Party, frankly, among the two-party establishment, to be a good position on Israel is not the position that many people on the left take. So there was some frustration with respect to you walking back your support of Roger Waters, the kind of repeated choice to go to Rabbi Shmuley and more conservative members of the community when you are being criticized with these accusations of anti-Semitism. You've spoken about your, quote, unconditional support of Israel. And at a time when progressives were just kind of tacitly sanctioned in the House for saying, in agreement with the international community, that Israel is an apartheid state, when the Democratic House caucus is passing a resolution saying categorically it is not an apartheid state against what Amnesty International and all these other groups have said, that it's not a racist state. Is that a kind of censorship as well that you're concerned about? Shouldn't elected Democrats, elected House members have the ability to criticize any nation state without it seeming like it's a violation that it needs to be responded to with this kind of a resolution, this kind of codified censorship?
Yeah, I mean, I think people ought to be able to criticize Israel, and I don't think it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Here's the distinction. If you're criticizing Israel and not applying the same standards to neighboring states or other states, in other words, if you're making a special category to criticize Israel that's unique to Israel and letting all the other states do the worse, much worse, that then evinces a bias. And let me tell you why I think the moral case for Israel, and that which would take me hours to lay out. But Israel, if you want freedom, if you're, for example, a woman, you'd rather live in Israel than any of the neighboring countries. If you're gay, 2 weeks ago there was a gay pride parade in Israel, 150,000 people. At the same time, Iran was hanging gays from cherry pickers in the major cities. if you're a woman, if you want freedom of religion, you've got to be in Israel. There are Palestinians on the Israeli Supreme Court. Can you imagine there being a Jew on the Supreme Court of any other country in the Mideast? So what I'm saying is, and the conflicts between the historical conflicts between the Palestinian and the Israel and Israel are, if you look at the history of that, it has nothing to do with what happened in South Africa. This is an historical conflict that Israel has repeatedly made huge concessions to try to settle. The Palestinian leadership, I think, has let down the Palestinians time and time again. I refuse. The Palestinian Authority pays Palestinians to kill Jews at this point.
So there's a lot that is disputed in there. But let me just start by saying Human Rights Watch, for instance, qualifies Israel as an apartheid state for the following reasons. It points to sweeping restrictions on the movement of Arabs, Palestinians in the region, widespread land confiscation, the imposition of harsh conditions which have led to thousands of Palestinians leaving their homes under conditions that amount to forcible transfer, the denial of residency rights to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and their relatives, and the suppression of basic civil rights to millions of Palestinians. So I think that many people bristle at this characterization that, well, there's a double standard that people are applying to neighboring Arab nations in Israel. I think most of us would be happy and are happy to point to any number of human rights violations that happen in other countries around the world, including in the Middle East. The question is whether or not, because of our quote-unquote special relationship with Israel, the amount of money that we give to Israel, the amount of arms that we fund with respect to the Israeli defense, I think as part in our own military interest, not because of a, I think, particular interest subjectively in the well-being of Jewish people living in the region, that we have an obligation to be more critical of a state that we have so much financial entanglement with. So what do you say to that? That in fact the double standard is people who are willing to criticize those other Arab states while ignoring what our own money is funding in Israel?
Yeah, and I think that we can criticize our friends. Israel is the only democracy in the Mideast, and all of those issues, the difficult relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, I believe time and time again the Israelis have, in good faith, various Israeli governments going back to Ehud Barak have tried time and time again to settle in the most generous possible terms possible. If you're dealing with leadership that adopts a charter that we're not just going to go after military targets, we are encouraging our people to kill as many Jewish civilians as possible, which is the policy of the PA, the policy of Hamas. You look at any country that has security issues, and there's going to be some kind of oppression. During World War II, we're a big country. We put all the Japanese residents, citizens, in concentration camps in our country.
Right.
And Israel's a tiny country surrounded by hostile countries, each one sworn to the genocidal destruction of every Jew in Israel. There is a security issue there, and those kind of security problems require a kind of care and security precautions that anybody else in the world would be a million times more.
So does that justify then something like these illegal settlements that have been roundly criticized by the international community, or maintaining Palestinians in what have been described as open-air prison type states with unequal access to water and basic life-sustaining provisions? Would you condemn those settlements?
Again, the Israelis again and again during the negotiations have offered to close those settlements and to obliterate them and to move their populations out. So
out into where? Because I think the fundamental issue is that, and it's a matter of Israeli policy, and this is part of why.
If you let me finish. In fact, in polling, the residents of those settlements have favored closing the settlements in exchange for real peace agreement. So what the Israelis have said, we will close those settlements. We will trade land for peace. The Israelis have said that again and again and again. In every instance, the Palestinians have refused.
So I think this is the fundamental issue, is that there's some substantive disputes over the timeline of who said no to which kind of agreements and who's at fault for the viability of the two-state solution being increasingly not viable, especially because of the increased expansion of the settlements and the fact that there isn't enough land left, basically, for them to really be an integrated Palestine at this point, which is why the left has moved from a position of a two-state solution to something that needs to be closer to a one-state solution. But the problem with the latter, and this is why Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, et cetera, have described this as an apartheid state, is that the stated position of the Israeli government is that if we were to fully allow Arab Palestinians to have full citizenship and voting rights because of the population's reality of the states, they feel like they can no longer maintain a Jewish state. And a stated desire to do exactly that is definitionally, if you want to enforce laws that keep people at various statuses of citizenship within a country, that's how we get to the position where it's an apartheid state. So then how do you square a condemnation of some of those actions on the part of the Israeli government, which we send so much money to, with what you said before, which is that you have this, quote, unconditional support? How can you, and when we have this monetary relationship with Israel, also support unconditional support while having the ability to criticize the actions of a government?
Well, by unconditional support, I don't mean that I'm going to co-sign every action by Netanyahu or Likud or whatever, or the settlements, or a particular settlement or a particular policy. I don't mean that. I mean that we have a special relationship with Israel. Israel is an outpost of democracy. And one of the ways to think about this is that after World War II, we developed the same special relationship with Turkey and with Greece because we believe that keeping those countries functional in that part of the world was an important barrier against the expansion of adversaries. Today, we have the Chinese and Russians moving into the Mideast in force. The one ally that we have that is really reliable is Israel, but not only that, Israel is an oasis of democracy. It's the only democracy in the Mideast. It's the only, listen, even if you're a Palestinian, it's going to be better to be in Israel. If you want to criticize your government, you better do it in Israel than any of the surrounding governments.
Before we let you go, I want to turn one more time to the hearing you participated in today. You spoke, it seemed off the cuff for your actual opening remarks, like you had something prepared, but then you addressed it when Representative Osborn and Schultz talked.
Yeah.
Sure. You spoke about Americans being at a time of such bitter division. I mean, the hearing was evidence of that division. So much strife and disagreement, including on COVID matters, vaccines, mandates, everything. What is your pitch to a public that is wildly divided on even just the subject of vaccines? Whether they're a good idea, whether they should be required, for who, for what age range, what kind of effect they had on the pandemic. What is your pitch for some kind of vision where people can, make their own choices about it and let other people make different choices and have that be okay and us all live together in the same country?
Yeah, I mean, on that issue particularly, I'm character. Part of the way of silencing me is by telling everybody that I'm anti-vaccine. I'm not anti-vaccine. I was fully vaccinated, not with COVID, but I was compliant with all my childhood vaccines.
They tried to use that as a gotcha question today. They were like, "You're vaccinated."
Yeah, people don't know, and you're
like,
I heard it admit it before.
My kids were all fully vaccinated. My wife got 3 vaccines during COVID. Half my kids got vaccinated by COVID, and the other ones didn't. But and we get along as a family. My job is not to tell people whether to take a vaccine or not. That's up to the individual. My job is to make sure that we have the best science possible. And the problem with vaccines, in my view, the reason I've been a critic is because vaccines are the only medical product that do not have to undergo placebo-controlled testing prior to license by FDA, the only medical product or medical device. We have 72 vaccines doses that are now mandated for our children. And in many states, they're federally recommended, which means mandated in many states. And none of them have gone through a pre-licensing safety test with a placebo. And because of that, we do not know the risk profile of those products. And nobody can make a rational, common sense, prudent decision about the risk and benefits. So, and that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, I don't want to ban vaccines. I don't want to tell people you can't get it, you can. I think we ought to have choice, number one, and we ought to have the best science possible.
I've been intrigued by some of the kind of structural critiques you've made. For example, the existence of this National Vaccine Compensation Fund and the fact that there's this limited liability for these manufacturers. And that does seem to tacitly acknowledge that if they were able to be sued for all of the vaccine injuries, that potentially the pharmaceutical manufacturers wouldn't see it as financially viable to continue to manufacture vaccines despite them having these public health issues or benefits. So I wonder, you're saying, and you've been very clear that you're not anti-vaccine and that you have taken advantage of vaccine and your kids and family members have taken the vaccines because of their protective value. But as you critique things like the limited liability of pharmaceutical companies and the choice to set up the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust, are you concerned that as president, if that trust fund, if that structure were to change, if we were to get rid of that and open up liability for pharmaceutical companies, that the consequence might be that we don't have access to life-saving, world-changing vaccines anymore?
I don't think so. And I think that there are other ways to do that, but to make sure that the vaccines are safe. I think that's what we have to do. I think we need really good safety testing to make sure that they're safe. And, it may be that there's some vaccines that, people would say, I don't want that one. I don't want a rotavirus vaccine. I don't want a hepatitis B vaccine, 4 hepatitis B vaccines. You get hepatitis B is spread through, through unprotected sexual activity and hypodermic needles. So, maybe I will wait till my child's older to get that vaccine like they do in other countries. And people ought to have those choices. That's all.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for joining us in studio today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
More Rising right after this.
So now that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is Kamala Harris's official running mate, we thought we'd turn to some reaction from the Midwest. We turned to Nebraska's Dan Osborn, who's running as an independent for Senate. He was a union president in 2021 when workers went on strike at 4 Kellogg's plants, including his own. They were able to secure a huge contract that covered all 4 plants. And there was an announcement Tuesday that one of the 4 plants will shut down in 2026 as sales are down about 4%. So Dan, thanks for coming on. Let's start with Tim Walz. We have a guy from the Midwest who has focused a lot of his political career on delivering for working and middle-class families. I'm surprised the Democrats picked this guy, but I'm pleasantly surprised. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I hate to disappoint you. I was just on News Nation and I saw a statistic that, or a poll, 71% of people don't really know much about him. And I certainly land in that 71%. Really, the only thing I know about him is he is from Nebraska, I heard. So always got to root for hometown people for sure. But otherwise, unknown to me.
So you're running for the Senate. What are you running on, and what do you think you're running as an independent? What do you think the major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are missing about the needs of working class people right now?
Yeah, well, I served in the United States Navy. I served in the Nebraska Army National Guard. Haven't always been a political guy really until corporate greed came knocking on my door. The company I was working for made record profits during COVID. The CEO gave himself a $2 million raise, and they tried to take from their workers. So we stood up for what we believed was right. And it opened my eyes to realizing that, we can really make a difference in people's lives, regular people's lives. But, this is a completely grassroots campaign. And what we're doing is we're going around talking to everybody in Nebraska. So these aren't necessarily my issues, but the top 3 issues that Nebraskans are concerned about is the economy. Number 1, people are hurting. Number 2, they're concerned about border security. Nebraska is a very big meat packing state. And number 3, it's got to be individual liberties.
So Dan, I went and talked to a bunch of workers in Nebraska, just regular people, asked what they think about your campaign. And while a lot of people question whether or not an independent can win. I think your campaign is proving that people want that. People are sick of getting a lot of campaign promises from either major party that are not made good on once they get into public office. You hired two different groups, one that focuses on typically, right-wing polling or polling on the right, one that focuses on polling on the left. And they came together and they found that you and Deb Fischer, the sitting senator that you're running for the seat of, are neck and neck at 42% and 42%. Is this a race that is winnable for people that are wondering if an independent can win in the Senate?
Yeah, this race is absolutely winnable. People are frustrated with both parties catering to their extremes right now. There's no Democrat in my race, so very unique in the fact it's just Republican versus independent. But you mentioned the poll. Impact Research is a Biden-Harris pollster, and we did it in conjunction with Red Wave Strategies, which is the same pollster Vivek Ramaswamy uses. So it's a very bipartisan poll, but it just it really reiterates what I already know, and that's going around talking to everyday Nebraskans that are frustrated with what they see in D.C. They're frustrated mostly with this corporate agenda that they all have and the amount of money that it takes to run for office. They're going to spend $100 million to run for office, run for Senate in Montana and Texas this year. So people are very interested in what we're talking about, which is campaign finance reform, ending Citizens United, just getting the money out of politics. Because until we do that, our issues, I'm not saying they don't matter. Of course they matter, but nothing's really going to change for us and with the government for corporations in the 1%.
It seems like we've heard from many corporate leaders that they've made their peace with Donald Trump and at some points having an antagonistic relationship with him in the past, but he's promised, massive corporate tax cuts and has brought a lot of corporate leaders back into the fold. Actually, the market. The stock markets have not done well in the last few days, possibly because Kamala Harris has rebounded or is doing better than Joe Biden was. They're maybe afraid of her presidency, although, of course, many Democratic elites have had a cozy relationship with corporations as well. I think it can be very discouraging for working people, ordinary people, trying to even grapple with the amount of influence in money and how much power that can buy in Washington. And you also talked about a minute ago the fears that people have about individual liberties being violated. That's something always very close to my heart. Something I'm always frustrated about as a libertarian. What kind of what change do you hope to make, or what policies do you hope to be able to implement if you were to be elected?
Yeah, so you mentioned libertarian. I have a lot of libertarian viewpoints as well. I do believe a smaller government can be a better government. I always keep a copy of the Constitution here, and in the Constitution, the cover of mine, George Washington warned us of the two factions, and that's kind of what we got here today. And the two factions are controlled by corporations. My opponent, Deb Fischer, she's taking money from Facebook, Boeing, the meat packers here, the Class 1 railroads, and she does their bidding. So for me, we've raised over $2 million. We've out-fundraised Deb Fischer in the second quarter. My average donation is $35. I'm not taking a dime of corporate money because I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. But, I talked about the economy and that being top on Nebraska's list. That's something we really have to focus on and stop kicking the can down the road. And both parties, all administrations have been guilty of adding $5 to $7 trillion to the debt. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to clean our own house. You look at the Department of Defense has never passed a federal audit. They actually have, from what I understand, over $30 trillion in unaccounted for assets. $30 trillion. Our national debt's $36 trillion. So, these are staggering figures that we have to do a hard reset, and we have to hold, these government agencies accountable for their budgets. And that's where it starts. And then, we have to do a deep dive into corporate gouging. $250 used to fill my grocery cart up for a family of 5. Now it barely skims the bottom. It's frustrating times for people. Taxes, everything's just going up so quickly. Me as a mechanic, I'm not a rich guy. It's definitely hitting home with me. And, this is the richest country in the world. But we have to have that reverse that transfer of wealth that we've seen in this country of $50 trillion from 90% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. We got to figure that part out.
Dan, I have to ask this as a daughter of America's working class with a dad who's in his 60s and still working with his hands to provide for the family. You are someone who's not a typical politician. You are not a lawyer. You are not someone who had a career in politics. You're a steam fitter. You're a union guy. You still work with your hands while you're on the campaign trail. Deb Fischer, for contrast, some of her top donors are railroad companies, and the largest rail yard in the world is in your home state, her home state of Nebraska, where she represents. There's a bit of a conflict of interest there, and a lot of workers I talk to in Nebraska are not happy with her not supporting things like the Railroad Safety Act. Can you just speak to how your experience as a working man influences how you would represent people in Congress?
Yeah, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, if you lean left or you lean right. I get along with the majority of people that I come in contact with because I am them, right? I understand the value of 8 hours hard work for 8 hours pay. I know what it's like to have to put Christmas on a credit card. When you talked about the railroads, I did an event in Columbus, Nebraska, at one of the oldest taverns here in the state, and there's a rail line that goes right by it, and a train was coming by in the middle of my talk, and I stopped right there and I said, this is why we have to pass the Rail Safety Act. I mean, if one of those cars were to derail that close to a city center like that, Columbus has like 27,000 people. It's not a super small town. But it would be devastating. We've had 4 derailments here in Nebraska in just the last 2 months. One of them very close to an anhydrous plant. So until we can pass these safety measures, and Deb Fischer sat on the transportation committee that allowed them to police their own safety, and they actually have death factored into their safety program as acceptable, and that's not acceptable to me. We have to keep our citizens safe. And that's sometimes you have to put people over profit. It's a hard pill to swallow for corporations that don't understand that concept.
Dan Osborn, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you both.
If you spend any time on X or on Substack reading the most thought-provoking essays from conservatives, you've probably encountered Richard Hanania. Richard is the author of the book, The Origins of Woke, which explains how civil rights law created the conditions for woke progressives to engage in ideological enforcement in schools and in the workplace. He is extremely critical of woke progressives, and during the pandemic he strongly denounced COVID overreaches like mask mandates and school closures. But Richard also has a lot of strident criticisms for conservatives. He writes that on average right-wing people are not as well informed as left-wing people, and has also authored a recent newsletter piece that I thought this audience would like to hear about. It's titled Why Americans Should Die for Ukraine, challenging prevailing wisdom on the right about the importance of U.S. involvement in that conflict. Richard Hanania joins me now to discuss that and much more, the election, politics, etc. Richard, I read a lot of what you write, and I find myself nodding along in agreement, sometimes vigorous agreement with like most of it, and then I'll read something that I totally disagree with, or even something that like offends me on a visceral level. That's probably a good trait for an intellectual, that I don't just like automatically agree with what you say, or I think it's worth reading even when I don't appreciate it. But you would, I think, concede that you have been lumped under a variety of ideological categories on the right broadly over the last few years. I think I knew you first as a kind of Iraq War critic, non-interventionist. I think that's what you were on Rising the first time to talk about. And then we were like very in sync on COVID stuff. But you're now more of like a liberal internationalist foreign policy person, but you're also libertarian on a lot of regulatory issues. So why don't you describe yourself for viewers who are thinking right now, who is this person and this doesn't make any sense?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Robbie. I'm an independent writer, so I have the luxury of being able to say what I think and write what I want to write about and not be necessarily beholden to any line. And sometimes I can change my mind and I don't have to just explain it. Well, I explain it to my readers, but I don't have to, explain it to some ideological movement or donors or something like that. But basically, if you just want sort of the summary of my politics, I'm a classical libertarian. I used to be, the big substantive change in my politics over the last 3 years or so has been on foreign policy. I've become more sympathetic towards liberal internationalism, less sympathetic towards restraint or isolationism. I haven't gone the full, sort of resistance, MSNBC, State Department line. In some ways, I go beyond them on certain issues on foreign policy. I think Trump's Middle Eastern policy, the Abraham Accords, I think was a huge success. So in some ways, I'm to the right of the foreign policy establishment. In some ways, I'm with them. But other than that, I'm basically a libertarian, classical liberal who's critical of both sides.
So, what are your takeaways from the election? We just had with Trump winning massively. I think most reasonable people expected it was going to be close, and either was capable of winning, and that is the case. But Trump happened to win by a lot more than many people expected. Republicans winning all over the place on I don't even on issues, on responses, on gut feelings that things are wrong with the economy and immigration and other such issues. Trump is going to have more of a free hand, I think, or he has fewer people in the Republican Party or in the prospective administration that are going to stop what he wants to do. We don't exactly know what he even wants to do on a variety of subjects, but he has this time around surrounded himself with a really unique set of ideological people, with former Democrats like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, but then also Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. Will Elon Musk be the actual president of this country, with Trump just kind of operating as the front man or the spokesperson for the tech right agenda?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways of looking at this Trump victory, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, first of all, I think just we have to sort of from a historical perspective and sort of from a perspective of historical causation, just acknowledge Trump's unique appeal. I was looking at the results that, the Mark Robinson scandal, and Mark Robinson lost by 10, 15 points because, of course he did. He had this scandal where he was on this pornographic website and talking about all kinds of weird things. Carrie Lake is another kind of person who, lost by a comfortable amount in Arizona. And like these people, Trump has a lot of the flaws. I mean, he's an election denier like Carrie Lake. He says crazy things, including things that, arguably are bragging about sexually assaulting women. But it doesn't harm him. So I think there's just like, first of all, we have to have acknowledgement that this is a unique kind of historical figure with a unique appeal. And as for his victory, there's two ways to look at it. So the tech right, this is something that I wrote about last year. It was the emergence of these people in Silicon Valley. I was thinking about Mark Andreessen, lesser extent Elon Musk. I mean, he had bought Twitter at that point. He hadn't gone all in on Trump yet. So you have these influences. And these are generally pro-market, libertarianish people, but at the same time, you have like these leftists like RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, and even Vance, who's sort of who is lumped in with the tech right, but is also says a lot of stuff that's friendly to economic populism. So one of these sides, there's a kind of tension here. I think that probably I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the classical liberals, libertarians are probably going to get their way because that's where the GOP establishment is. I don't think RFK and Tulsi Gabbard are going to be as influential on policy as, say, Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or somebody like Peter Thiel is going to be. But it's going to be an interesting tension. It's going to be interesting to watch. And then, so that's like the elite level. And then you could look at the level of sort of the mass public. And the story here is the Hispanic vote. I mean, it's a 25-point shift over one election cycle. Democrats went from winning 33 by 33 points, according to the NBC exit poll, to winning by 8 points this time. So 25-point shift in one election cycle, with the same candidate on the ballot. This is also sort of remarkable. I wrote an essay the other day about how this sort of discredits both the left and the right in their sort of demographic, determinism. We used to hear a lot about this during the days of the Obama coalition. They told us about the browning of America. This was something liberals, took seriously and were sort of optimistic about. Maybe Republicans could squeeze out one or two more elections, but then we're on a path to a permanent majority. And then Republicans started to believe it, and people like Tucker Carlson, like Ed Coulter, were saying, okay, we have to keep the country white because, as liberals tell us, it's going to be a less white country, so Republicans will never be able to win an election again. And as it turned out, Hispanics are basically, if you can shift people to 25 percentage points in one election cycle, like you would be foolish to be making predictions 20, 30 years down the line, generationally. Also, Trump's success, the other part of the demographic momentum was about the idea that young people in general were moving to the left. And we've seen, a shift in the other direction too. So I think that there's just it's a huge victory for Trump, for the Trump movement, and also like a blow against this demographic determinism, which I think is unhealthy for both sides. It's unhealthy when the left sits there and say, we're going to become less white, therefore we're going to win. And it's unhealthy when conservatives sit there and say, we need to restrict immigration because we're getting replaced. So that's something that makes me optimistic.
We're going to talk a lot more about that coming up next. Back with Richard Hanania, the author of the book, The Origins of Woke, talking about the election and just other stuff. We were talking in the first part of our interview about shifting demographics. This is something I have been talking about for a long time, and I'm wondering if now the Republican Party will finally notice. And it actually has to do with wokeness, because I realized a while ago, and you probably realized this too, that the wokest people, like the people who want to say Latinx and trigger warnings, etc., are, well, first of all, they're disproportionately affluent and highly educated people, and they're the native-born citizenry. They're the people whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower or whatever. So that was my first attempt to disabuse conservatives of the notion that more immigration was going to make the Republican Party unelectable. More immigrants. And this is not going to be true universally, certainly, but especially fleeing socialist country who are Catholic and want to work. This is a demographic we should be absolutely chasing and catering to. And I'm wondering if the Republican Party, this will be the election they realize that, and will it be the election the Democratic Party realizes that they're going to lose because of immigration on two ways: for not taking the issue of illegal immigration seriously enough, or what, as all the polls show, and because the immigrants themselves don't like the cultural attitudes of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, you're right. And I think another thing too is just we've seen in the last few years, just internationally, if you think Latin Americans are always going to be leftist, I mean, have you looked at Argentina? Have you looked at El Salvador, where Bukele had just decided to lock up all the criminals and has a 90% approval rating or whatever it happens to be? And yes, and sometimes in Latin America you get a Hugo Chavez or a Maduro or a Castro in a non-democratic setting. But I think all of this is just to show you history is a living thing. It's not like you can just sit there and count up the whites and count up the Hispanics and count up the blacks and in 2040 or 2050 know what America is going to look like. So I think conservatives and liberals and all people who are into ideas, we should just be fighting the battle of ideas, and maybe one demographic leans one way or the other, but that's not determinative. And it's just good if our politics, if we just don't think like this.
All right, I wanted to argue with you a little bit about the Ukraine topic. You wrote, that basically, I think I would summarize your piece as we don't, libertarian or classically liberal people, which I absolutely include myself in that category, suffer from an inability to tell a grand narrative about what should be done, or say this is the external enemy to fight, internal or external, or you're being screwed, or the things that are bad are because of this specific entity to go after. I mean, I would argue that it's just kind of the government or government regulation, but it's an amorphous thing. It's not an easily identifiable thing. And so actually having but China and Russia are run by actually bad identifiable individuals, and being against them is a unifying and good thing, which I agree with that sort of philosophically. But then in terms of the policies, I don't know, man. I see a lot of parallels to Iraq and all of the and Libya and all the misadventures in the Middle East, sending weapons to some other country that's going to is slowly being taken over or conquered by bad people anyway, then they end up with all those weapons. Is that a good use of our money? Certainly if Ukraine wants to resist the country invading them, I say more power to them. They were invaded unjustly by an evil government. But I also want to be realistic, and I don't think they can defeat Russia, and I would rather have everybody stop dying. And if Trump, who sounds like he wants to convince them to make peace, wouldn't that be a better thing?
Yeah, I mean the piece, the title was a little bit tongue in cheek, and I like to do this because I want people to read the article. I want to get their attention, but then I want them to read the article.
I've noticed that from all your articles about how
hey,
attractive Sydney Sweeney is. I've gotten that.
Well, that one, the title and the article were both in tune. That one was a tongue in cheek, but yeah, on this one, I mean, what you're saying a lot of reasonable things. I think the libertarian problem is, yeah, you could say the government. People need meaning. People sort of need an enemy. They need a narrative, and you could say government, but government is often just us. So if you look at something like housing, why is it so hard to build? People are just, NIMBYs. I mean, it's just your neighbor down the street is worried about his home value. And that's really hard to make into an enemy. And you don't want to make that person into an enemy, right? Something like, out of control government spending. It's often on entitlements, things people want. And so that's sort of the core of it, is you sort of need this for human nature. And if you and this is you could see the left as sort of wokeness. You could see the right as just conspiracy theories, just looking for the deep state, looking for something that they can hold on to. And if we're going to hate somebody, I say Putin and Xi Jinping are good candidates. Now, you say this sounds like the kind of thinking that led us into Iraq. And I think you're right to be hesitant here. And I think that the problem with Iraq, and I think that we've sort of learned perhaps the wrong lesson. I think we've learned that we should just not. A lot of people have taken it as we should not be involved in the world. I think the lesson is you should not be sending ground troops to fundamentally remake societies. And I think Libya was similar in that Libya had. I mean, it was just we're going to overthrow Gaddafi, and there wasn't even a theory of who was going to replace him. You have to be very, very careful. And American soldiers are not good at this kind of nation building, this kind of social engineering. What we were doing in Iraq and what we were doing in Afghanistan, these were not realistic missions. Now, something like Ukraine, I know people who are opposed to Ukraine will say, we don't want World War III. We don't want our American kids, dying for Ukraine. That's not happening. That's not on the table. What Ukraine wants is money, and what Ukraine wants is arms, and they have a just cause. And I think that you're right. There is a kind of there is reason to be skeptical that they can actually defeat Russia. I mean, I think maybe there is a role for us to perhaps nudge them in the direction of a peace settlement. But I think whatever that looks like in the end, you could either have a strong Ukraine or you could have a weak Ukraine. And a Ukraine that has more money and more weapons is always going to be in a better position to negotiate. I think a lot of people on the right, particularly, just sort of want to cut off Ukraine, and that's the way you end the war. I don't think that's a moral or a just outcome, and I don't think that's good for us, sort of, just sort of psychologically, and for the national spirit and for what we stand for in the world. Because I don't think I think this is something that realists and restrainers get wrong. A nation sort of has to have a purpose, and you can take it too far. You could end up, 20 years of nation building in Afghanistan, and that could be a mistake. But just to say we're going to hunker down and we couldn't care less what happens. Putin wants to take over half of Ukraine and put everybody who speaks out against him into camps, and we're just fine with that. I don't think that that's good for us either.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want Ukraine to just fall overnight and suddenly become a part of Russia and have people in Kiev who don't want to live under Putin's regime being forced to do that. I mean, I think if this is as important a national security objective or a European security objective, then their neighbors, the European countries, should primarily be the ones spending more money to send weapons and take care. If it's that important, they should be a little bit more exercised than us, across the sea. But at the same time, if it's just about, if the easternmost provinces of Ukraine, which have changed hands, I certainly can't take the position that people never have the right to like disassociate from one nation if they feel more cultural kinship with another, as some of the people in the borders and those territories do with Russia. It ends up being a little bit more complicated. Yes, I don't think the entire country, I mean, I don't think anyone should live under a regime they don't want to live under, but I can't say that this border, which has only existed for so long, is the only construction for this group of ethnic different identities who didn't necessarily perceive themselves as all the same people going back historically, and that we across the sea should spend a significant amount of military resources trying to preserve that status quo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that the problem is that once you open the door to redrawing borders, and this is the what Woodrow Wilson had discovered after World War I, you open up a can of worms, and you don't want to be there because every border could potentially be subject to revision. So just a hard and fast rule that says the borders today, we're sticking by them, and deal with it, learn to live with people, I think is a good rule, because otherwise you sort of have this endless conflict. Now, in extreme situations like Sudan, where like South Sudan was being slaughtered, they were being there's like a genocide going on. Sure, something like that, maybe you can support a secessionist movement. But I think that like the idea that I don't think the treatment of Russians in eastern Ukraine was that extreme. I don't think they would have I don't think they would have risen up and been able to break off without Russian support and Russian leadership to a large extent. I mean, people talk about how in 2014, there was a little more support for Russia in the eastern provinces. In 2022, they really didn't find that much and just had to rely on brute force. I don't think this is the kind of behavior we can accept. I mean, we might have to accept it as a matter of realism. Russia is just a lot bigger and more powerful than Ukraine, and it just means more to them. But yeah, I don't think we should grant moral legitimacy to that claim, except again in the most extreme circumstances.
Let's go back to U.S. politics to wrap this up. You're describing yourself as a classical liberal, libertarian of some sort. I think of myself that as well. I actually voted for the Libertarian Party's candidate, even though increasingly members of the top leadership of the Libertarian Party went all in for Trump and urged people who feel that way to do that. Trump himself has moved, as we discussed a little bit earlier. The party under Trump, the Republican Party, has in some ways moved in a less libertarian direction on trade, on tariffs. There actually isn't the Democratic Party is maybe better on free trade. There's neither of the major parties are where I would want them to be on these issues. But there's been a slightly different foreign policy, and then maybe in terms of the running of the government and the internal regulations, how much the IRS is going to harass you, how much the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is going to harass your small business. On that, he's probably just as much, or where any other Republican was on having a limited or restrained government view. I think those issues, it goes to what you're saying about libertarianism having a hard time finding an enemy to identify. It is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on some level. You talk to small business owners throughout the country who really don't care who the president is or don't even want to care who the president is, but know that under democratic governance, you just have more bureaucrats looking through your books, harassing you, making business more difficult for you, costs you must then pass on to your consumer, and under Republicans, you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think my case for Trump is, look, I believe in economic freedom. I think it's the most important thing, and I think it's the best thing for society. And Republicans just sort of as a knee-jerk thing, not because they're all necessarily reading Adam Smith and Frederick Hayek. I mean, I think there's, often in history, it's sort of people support good things for the wrong reasons. A lot of them are just, conspiracy theorists to think the government is out to get them. But they happen to.
Well, sometimes we're right when we think the government is out to get us, right?
And so, yeah, it depends on sort of how you formulate that statement, sure. But yeah, I mean, but another thing that you're getting at is sort of this anti-trade, kind of, and there's this sort of economic populism that Trump sounds, sympathetic to, and Vance sounds sympathetic to. I think I go by the first administration, and for the most part, I mean, they didn't do that stuff. I actually created a betting market on the degree to which Trump will have a major tariff. So it was conditional. If Trump wins, will the total tariffs reach like 6% on weighted goods? And there's a way to calculate that. And I took the side of no, because I wanted to publicly say, like, I think tariffs will go up a little bit, like they did in the first administration. But, if we, from what we can measure, I don't think we're going to get extreme. So he promised a 10% tariff. I put the number at 6%, that we would not get, up to 6%. It's about 3-4% now. But it's if you take the economic nationalism seriously enough, if I thought that like the worst statements of Trump and Vance on the economy were going to become law, I would probably vote for Harris or like restrain from voting. I don't believe that from the first administration. I don't believe that based on sort of the power centers within the Republican Party, based on where most senators and most members of Congress are at. On immigration and trade, yes, because there's a general sort of, sort of anti-foreigner thing going on that, there's kind of a demagoguery on the right. But in general, I think Republicans are better for economic growth. I think we've seen that at the state level. I have an analysis of 40 years of basically economic freedom being correlated with growing population and faster GDP growth. And so, yes, I mean, I think we're at the point where the reasonable position is like Republicans are still better at the economy, but there's a lot of sort of trends and intellectual currents on the right that are worth worrying about and thinking about how to counteract.
Richard Hanania, thank you so much for joining me today. This was very enjoyable.
Thank you, Robbie.
Columbia students are continuing to protest today after University President Dr. Shafik dropped a midnight deadline for protesters to abandon their encampment. Minouche released a statement at 11 p.m. last night saying, quote, "Talks have shown progress and are continuing as planned. We have our demands, they have theirs." Students say they won't leave the encampments until the university agrees to financially divest from companies that do business with Israel. Minouche faces mounting criticism from students, faculty, politicians, and donors after over 100 student protesters were arrested. The University Senate is scheduled to meet today to vote on a resolution that expresses displeasure with her decisions. Columbia Spectator journalist Emily Forgash has been reporting on the ground of Columbia University throughout the protests and joins us now. Thanks for being with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So I want to get into some of the aftermath of these arrests of 100, I think, plus students, some professors as well. Has this shifted any sentiment of people who were initially critical of the encampment? Has this changed anything, the response by calling the police in and the police's behavior?
So the police were called in by Shafik the day after the encampment started. So last Thursday, Shafik authorized the police to come onto campus, and that's when the arrests were made. And the encampment had started just over 24 hours beforehand. And there were hundreds and hundreds of spectators to the police coming into the encampment and arresting the students. And very shortly after, everyone watched this happen on campus. The people that were watching kind of replicated the encampment on the other side of the South Lawns on Columbia's main campus. And so I would say that kind of watching your fellow peers get arrested and everyone kind of rallying around and seeing that definitely created a different environment on campus after that point, where people were a little bit more, I would say, committed to the cause. And the encampment that is now on the west side of South Lawns is still there today.
Some of the mainstream media coverage of the encampment has accused some of the students of violence, some outside agitators of violence. Have you personally witnessed any incidences of violence, or is the university more upset just about the fact that there is this physical encampment that might be impeding other students from using public spaces?
So when Shafik authorized the NYPD to come onto campus, in her statement, she said that there was a clear and present danger, and that's why she was authorizing the police to come onto campus. The police chief, though, after the fact, said that the encampment itself was very peaceful and that the students were expressing themselves in a peaceful manner. Spectator itself has reported a number of incidents from protests that are outside the gates of Columbia's university, including a protest that happened last night. So there have been incidents of aggression and sometimes violence and hatred in the protests that are outside Columbia's campus. Columbia's campus right now is locked to only people that hold Columbia University IDs. And so that's not to say that the people in the outside protest are 100% non-affiliates, but those are mainly non-affiliates in those outside protests, and that's where Spectator has reported most incidents. But there have been a few incidents on campus near the encampment. The encampment itself, I would say, is largely peaceful.
It sounds like a lot of other universities have joined in after Columbia's encampment in form of protest really led the way. Now, all of these protests nationwide have gotten the attention of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's made a statement about it, calling the protests something that can be compared to the demonstrations in Nazi Germany during World War II. What do you make of this? As a student, a lot of students on campus are in their late teens, early 20s, that you all have become the target of, a political phenomena, potentially, a genocide. Many people believe that there's enough evidence to call this a genocide, that now foreign leaders are making you all the target of their statements and speeches to the press.
I think it's challenging because Spectator has reported that a number of Jewish students feel unsafe on campus, and they feel like the encampment and the protests around the university at its gates have created an environment that's sometimes hostile or just hard to be on. And then Spectator has, though, also reported that the encampment itself and those student leaders who are leading the encampment have oriented their goals, as you mentioned before, towards divestment and then also towards making sure that we keep our eyes on what's happening in Gaza. And it's not just Netanyahu. There have been American politicians who have tweeted or even come to campus calling for Manu Shafik to resign, making statements about the student protesters on campus and the protests off campus. I think it's very difficult to really understand the environment at Columbia right now unless you step onto Columbia's campus itself, which very few people can do at the moment, only like credentialed press during certain periods of time and people, as I said, with Columbia University IDs. And I would say that it's a very, like the Columbia's Spectator's reporting is a little bit different sometimes than reporting from other news outlets because we're able to be on campus. And we've, as I said, there is a difference between our reports of incidents that many people refer to on campus in the encampment versus off campus. So I think that distinction is important to make.
So the president of Columbia, Manu Shafik, has said that while the students have their demands, which as we've discussed are mostly surrounding divestment, as well as having the university perhaps make stronger statements in regards to what's happening in Gaza, she says that the university has its demands as well. Do you have any sense of what the university's demands are? Are they mostly related to the disbursement of this encampment?
Spectator hasn't yet been able to report exactly what those demands are, but certainly the university is working towards trying to disperse the encampment because, as I said, a number of students have said that the encampment makes them feel unsafe. Manu Shafik testified in Congress last Wednesday, and much of what she talked about was regarding anti-Semitic incidents on campus, and that's what a bunch of the lawmakers were asking her about. And I definitely think that's front of mind for her administration, a number of students, as I mentioned, also the politicians that I mentioned. And so I think making sure that everyone feels safe on campus is probably part of their demands. But then also the university has announced that the people in the encampment have complied to a number of their requests, such as having a New York Police Department officer go into the encampment and make sure that their activities are completely safe, which the people in the encampment allowed to happen. So there has definitely been like ongoing negotiations, and the deadline keeps getting extended back more. So we'll kind of have to see when the negotiations end, what exactly the university wants to happen.
Now, the SIPA or SIPA school within Columbia University decided to create a task force addressing both anti-Semitic hatred and Islamophobia back in November. Have you seen Islamophobia on campus as well? And also, have you seen any impact of this task force or any failure to address, Islamophobia on campus that may have led to students taking an escalatory step to, create this encampment?
So the university itself created a task force on anti-Semitism before the encampment started last week. As you mentioned, it was just shortly after October 7th. I think it's interesting to talk about the entire, since October 7th, the months following, because there definitely have been incidents that spectators reported on of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We've released a number of articles regarding student experiences on both sides and how they feel on campus all throughout this conflict, not just within the past week. And so there have certainly been instances of that we've reported, like reportable instances. I would say that there is definitely a sentiment of confusion around kind of what the task force on anti-Semitism is currently doing. And then there has certainly been a reportable sentiment that students feel that the university isn't doing enough to address Islamophobia on campus, and that it's more oriented to addressing anti-Semitism, especially within the past week, and especially since, as I mentioned, Shafik testified in Congress. That was a main part of the conversation. And so students have definitely voiced concern that it's kind of that the university is unevenly addressing the problem of who is feeling unsafe on campus, especially in terms of the administration's rhetoric around the issue.
I'm not super familiar with Columbia's class schedule, to be honest, but I have read reports that you all are heading into finals season. Have you done any reporting or talked to any of the students who maybe aren't affiliated with the protest, and what potential impact this is having on their ability to prepare for finals, and kind of what the larger academic atmosphere looks like right now with this encampment on campus?
Sure. So starting on Tuesday of this week, the University Columbia's Morningside campus became hybrid, meaning that students who don't necessarily feel safe coming to classes right now have the option to join classes remotely via Zoom. And that has definitely taken place. There have certainly been students in classes who have taken that option, but I will say that there have been many students who are still going to classes in person. Our last day of classes is this upcoming Monday, and so that remote option is still available for students. And there are students who are not affiliated with the protests who are, walking through campus, walking to their classes, going to classes in person. And then our finals are starting soon, and the university announced that it's up to professors' discretion, but that they can make finals, have a remote option, cancel them, do whatever they see fit to make sure that it's fair for all students, no matter how they feel about coming to campus right now. So some professors have canceled finals, some have given remote options, et cetera. So they're trying to be flexible.
Now, Emily, you've done some reporting on the Union Theological Seminary president criticizing the NYPD sweep of the Gaza encampment. We've seen professors get arrested. This isn't just a protest done by the students. It seems that faculty and staff are getting involved as well. How has that shaped the political environment, if at all, on campus at Columbia?
Certainly. So faculty have definitely been involved in this issue since October 7th. Many faculty members have talked to Spectator about what they feel is happening in terms of academic freedom on Columbia's campus. That was definitely a big part of Spectator's reporting since October 7th. And then since the encampment, and specifically since the arrests and suspensions of a number of students, faculty have certainly been involved in this issue. This past Monday, there was a walkout of hundreds of professors and faculty members who on Columbia's campus, and they walked to Barnard's campus to deliver letters to Barnard's president and dean. And so they're certainly involved, and their voices are certainly being kind of amplified in this moment. Many of them are speaking up for students, especially students who have been suspended. So yeah, I would say faculty members are certainly involved. It's definitely not just a student and administrator situation right now.
We're out of time, but Emily Forgash, thank you so much for joining us and helping us to get a real on-the-ground perspective of what's been going on at Columbia.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
We are less than a week away from the election, and both candidates are making their closing arguments to the American people. This race is tight, very tight, and every vote will matter. Here with us today is Caroline Levitt, national spokesperson for Donald Trump's campaign. Let's get right into it. Caroline, thank you for joining us. I wanted to start with what the strategy is for the final 5 days. Is this about whipping Trump's base to the polls, or are you still trying to convert new voters?
Well, our strategy over the next 5 days is to do both. It's to encourage President Trump's base to turn out to the polls, and we're seeing that taking place. All the trends from early voting are very encouraging, and it also is a chance for President Trump to continue to reach new voters. As he barnstorms the country, he'll be holding multiple rallies in various states for the next 5 days, and his message is for all Americans. It's very simple. Kamala Harris broke it, and President Trump will fix it. Kamala broke our border, broke our economy, broke peace across the world over the past 4 years as vice president. And President Trump has real solutions to fix the problems we're seeing. And this message is working. If you've noticed in the past few weeks, President Trump has increased in the polls. He's leading in the Real Clear Politics average in every single battleground state. Our internal data reflects the same. And we are seeing a broad, diverse coalition of Americans coming to the table and saying they are supporting President Trump. Arab American leaders endorsing him in Michigan. The Jewish Americans are supporting him by a historic margin. You also have evangelical Christians, again, Americans of all faith, races, and religions are coming out in support of President Trump.
So, Caroline, obviously the president has made a number of comments recently about Pennsylvania, including alleging that Pennsylvania is cheating, I believe was his term. What's he basing that on?
Well, we won a lawsuit in Pennsylvania last night proving that there was illegal voter suppression taking place. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, voters were being turned away from the polls. We heard from numerous voters about this. Our legal team immediately responded. We sent a strongly worded letter to the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania a couple of days ago, who then responded by reiterating that election workers must allow voters to stay in line, cannot turn them away early. Even after the Secretary of State came out and said that, Bucks County was still turning voters away from the polls. So we filed litigation to amend that, and we won. The court proved that we were right, and voters have a right to stay in line. We also got an extension of 3 more days of early voting to amend the cheating and the voter suppression that was taking place. So it was a huge win for election integrity.
But whenever one says cheating, the perception is that that is something that is intended to tilt the outcome to one side or another. What happened in Bucks County was that workers at the county office, as I understand it, said to people, the office closes at 5, therefore you have to leave and you can't stay in line anymore. You guys took it to court, that was changed, and Bucks County is now complying with this extension. Do you think that is really fair to describe that as cheating? After all, you've no way of knowing whether the people in line were going to vote for former President Trump or Vice President Harris or any other candidate.
It's illegal voter suppression, and we don't care if those voters were voting for President Trump or Kamala Harris. We fought for the right of all voters in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to have the right to stay in line, and the court adjudicated that for us.
But was that cheating, is my point?
It's illegal voter suppression, yes, and the court proved it.
I wanted to follow up on another case out of Pennsylvania that was reported on just recently, where a group was sending out text messages to voters telling them that they had either already voted or were ineligible to vote. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case and what we know about who was behind this?
I'm not sure about that particular case, but I'm sure our election integrity legal team is on it.
Okay, and to get to another question, during the recent Joe Rogan interview with the former president, he talked about how one of his biggest regrets and mistakes in his first term was not picking the right people to be in his administration. And there were people who would actively work against some of his policy proposals and the things that he wanted to accomplish. As he's going into a potential second term, what is he doing to ensure that the right people are there that are going to actually enact his agenda?
Well, as President Trump has long said, he wasn't a Washington, D.C. guy when he was inaugurated as president of the United States. He was a New York guy. He wasn't a politician. He was a businessman. So he was new to the Washington, D.C. scene, and therefore he didn't know everyone. He had to just trust the recommendations of people he was just getting to know. But now President Trump has been in the political arena for 8 years. He understands who's good, who's bad, and who will help him implement his agenda to make America great again. There are so many talented people, both inside and outside government who we're hearing from every day that are excited about President Trump's chances of victory on Tuesday and would love to be part of his administration. And you've seen some of those people campaigning on behalf of President Trump, like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom are former Democrats, by the way, who realize the Democrat Party has moved so far to the left that they're now joining President Trump's team. We also have Elon Musk, who has been campaigning for us. President Trump has said he will lead a government efficiency commission to cut the waste in our federal bureaucracy that is ripping off taxpayers. So there are so many amazing people in this country who I know President Trump will consider once time comes.
I know, Caroline, when one talks to the Harris campaign, one of the things that they make much of is what they believe to be a superior so-called ground game in their case, that they have an infrastructure to get their voters out. Do you think that former President Trump doesn't require that same infrastructure? In other words, that his voters are just sort of more enthusiastic generally? Or do you think that your ground game is actually as good or better than the Harris campaigns?
I believe our ground game is better than the Harris campaigns. And let me tell you why. Our ground game is two things. It's one, data-driven, and it is people-powered. And our campaign for months, really for the better half of the last year, has been reaching out to voters directly in the key battleground counties and states. And we have identified people on the ground in these communities who are now serving as Trump Force 47 captains, as we call them. And the responsibility of these Trump Force 47 captains is to encourage voters in their respective communities and states to get out to the polls. And so we give them low impact tasks that will make a big difference on election day, and they are actively working on the ground. So it's people powered from the ground up rather than from the top down. And you do have an enthusiasm gap with the Democrat Party right now that we don't see with President Trump. President Trump is overwhelmingly supported by Republicans. We see this again in the early voting. We are winning the early vote in North Carolina. In Pennsylvania, there's been a 20-point swing from where we were in 2020 with Republicans in the early vote. We're leading the early vote in Georgia and Arizona as well. And it's a testament to our ground game that has been focused on registering and now turning out voters to the polls.
And certainly this early vote push is relatively new to the Republican Party. Is there any concern that you all could be cannibalizing people who would typically vote on Election Day, or are you seeing that these are really two separate groups and you still feel that you're going to have an advantage on November 5th?
Well, we've been encouraging all of our supporters to get out and to vote early very consistently for quite some time now. President Trump has been leading that message, and we are seeing that voters are heeding his calls. Again, I just looked at the data this morning. We get fresh data every morning, and we're still leading the early vote in North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia. And again, there's been a huge shift in Pennsylvania towards Republicans. Now, of course, we're expecting a big turnout on Election Day as well. But the key with early voting is you don't know what could happen to you on Election Day, right? You could be running late at work, you could have a family emergency, and you can't bank your vote. So we're focused on keeping this push going, banking as many votes early as possible, and then that way, those folks also have more time to encourage their friends and their neighbors to get out and to vote for President Trump as well.
Caroline, moving beyond Tuesday in a sense, I think one of the few things that almost everyone would agree on is that there's an enormously polarized nation. There's a lot of very angry people on both sides, and there's a lot of ill feeling in the political climate generally. Regardless of the result on Tuesday, will former President Trump do anything to tamp down those kind of tensions in the aftermath of the election?
Well, he already is, and you've already seen that taking place throughout this campaign. President Trump has now survived 2 heinous attempts on his life. And even in the face of such danger, the Democrat Party has continued to vilify President Trump and his supporters. You have Kamala Harris, who is comparing President Trump to some of the worst mass murderers in history, labeling him Hitler, labeling him a fascist. This is dangerous and divisive political rhetoric that has led to real political violence. And again, 2 attempts on President Trump's life. Whereas President Trump is really running the joyful campaign of this election cycle, focused on the issues that matter, an uplifting message to restore hope to this country by securing our southern border, tackling inflation, making life affordable again for working families, restoring peace in the Middle East, and ending the war in Ukraine, fixing all of these problems that Kamala Harris has created. But this is the optimistic message that he's he's sharing, and we're seeing it is resonating, whereas the closing message of the Kamala campaign right now is Donald Trump is evil, don't vote for him. And by the way, half the country is garbage. That's what the sitting president of the United States said 2 days ago.
But hold on a second now, Caroline. When we talk about people talking in crude terms, the former president has described Vice President Harris as mentally impaired, a low IQ individual, and I don't think I can say the profanity, but he preceded a description of her as vice president with a profane term meaning very bad. Those things don't raise up the tone of national discourse much, do they?
Calling someone a low IQ individual pales in comparison as to calling them Hitler. Hitler was the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world and killed millions of innocent people. And that's what Kamala Harris compares Donald Trump to. They also have been calling him a threat to democracy for 8 years, which is a disingenuous lie. They don't believe it, because if they did, then Democrats in blue wall states wouldn't be running advertisements trying to cozy up to Donald Trump right now. They are dishonest and they are divisive, and they're using this dangerous rhetoric to try to fear voters into voting for them and try to convince voters that Donald Trump is a legitimate threat to democracy, which is absurd. But voters aren't buying it, and that's why today in 2024, President Trump is more popular than he's ever been since 2016, because voters lived under President Trump for 4 years and they realized that our democracy was actually stronger under his term than it is today under Kamala Harris, when we are on the legitimate threat of a World War III. You have China and North Korea cozying up together. The Middle East is under fire. War is embroiled. We have an invasion on our southern border of illegal immigrants from all over this world. So our democracy is in peril today under who? Not Donald Trump, Kamala Harris. And that's what the American people see, and that's why President Trump is going to win on Tuesday.
He described Democrats as vermin, did he not?
Again, did you hear what I just said? Democrats have been calling President Trump a threat to democracy
Did he describe
for
Democrats as vermin, Caroline?
For 8 years. And the second gentleman who tried to kill President Trump and attempted to take his life echoed some of that same rhetoric on his social media. He said on his social media that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. That is the exact same rhetoric that is used from the Democrat Party against him for the past 8 years, and it has inspired 2 assassination attempts on President Trump's life.
And do you think it's acceptable to call members of the other party vermin?
I don't think it's acceptable to call President Trump Hitler. I don't think it's acceptable
for him to call them vermin, or no?
He hasn't said that about Democrats. He said that about the illegal immigrant criminals who are invading our country. And yes, I think that illegal immigrants who rape and murder innocent women, they are vermin. They are disgusting monsters and they should be deported.
He said it about, I believe, what he terms radical left Marxists. But in any event, I'll let Amber.
Nope, he didn't. He called illegal immigrant criminals vermin. You should go check your facts before you try to ask a question about it.
Fine, thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Moving to a different topic, I wanted to ask about Trump's strategy with independent media. He's been doing a lot of independent podcasts, including Joe Rogan, 41 million views. We just learned that J.D. Vance's interview with Joe Rogan went approximately 4 hours long, and then the former president was also endorsed by Jake Paul. What inspired this sort of novel media strategy, and what impact do you hope that it's going to have on voters?
Well, Americans don't trust the mainstream media anymore. Trust in our media networks is at an all-time low, and so they are seeking information and truth from alternative media sources such as the Joe Rogan podcast and many others that President Trump has participated in throughout this campaign. And this strategy has proven wildly successful. Every time President Trump has been on one of these podcasts, it instantly shoots up to #1 in the charts and breaks records. And it's because people want to hear what he has to say unfiltered from the mainstream media's bias. And so we've also been given free access to this podcast lane because Kamala Harris hasn't done many of them. She has refused to sit down with Joe Rogan. And frankly, it's because I think she's incapable of having real conversations about any issue under the sun without her team trying to dictate the topics in a set time. You look at Kamala Harris's interview with Fox News, you look at her town hall with CNN last week, every time she does an interview, she bombs. It's a train wreck, and it's because she has no conviction. She doesn't know where she stands on the issues. President Trump does, and whether you agree with him or disagree with him, you always know where he stands. And so that's why these conversations he has with these highly respected critical thinkers outside of the mainstream media are incredibly impactful and have been proven as an effective media strategy for us.
So the president referred to a New Hampshire crowd, since you asked us to fact check, and the quote is, "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs who live like vermin within the confines of our country. Who was he referring to?
Yeah, did he? So was he talking about Kamala Harris? Do you hear Kamala Harris anywhere in that sentence?
No.
No, you don't. Because
your
again,
argument was that he was
referring-
talking about illegal immigrants, which he clearly wasn't. He was talking
He's
about
referring
people who
to
he characterizes as far left.
Yeah, he's referring to communists and fascists and illegal immigrant thugs who have come into our country. Those were his words. Those are the people he's referring to. And are those the type of people you want in America? No, I don't think so.
He's
And
referring
American people don't want that either. And that's why 70% of Americans support mass deportations, support President Trump's plan for that, including Latino Americans, by the way, who come to this country legally and lawfully. President Trump is going to rid this country of people who hate us and break our nation's laws to get here.
I think, Caroline, with all due respect, you're trying to confuse two issues, which is illegal immigration, which he speaks strongly about, and the term vermin to refer to political opponents, which is what he's plainly talking about there.
That's not what he was referring to.
Okay,
I was there,
move on.
but okay.
Let's get a little bit into the gender gap. We see that Kamala Harris's campaign has an advantage with women voters, whereas Trump has an advantage with male voters. Trump has been doing things like town halls exclusively for women on Fox News, while Kamala Harris has started a Hunters and Anglers for Harris Walz coalition and also has Tim Walz going on video games. Can you talk a little bit about the campaign strategy to woo women voters and why you think the advantage with men is so large?
Well, Kamala Harris faces a real problem with the male gender gap. There's no doubt about it. And it's because her policies have hurt men over the past 4 years. So there's less money in their pockets. Men want to be protectors for their families. Kamala Harris has said on tape that she wants to go into the homes of law-abiding Americans and take their guns. That's not a very appealing message to law-abiding gun owners, particularly men who want the right to protect themselves and their families. Kamala Harris has been a terrible president for union workers. She wants to raise taxes. That's why union workers and many men who work in labor unions are supporting President Trump. 60% of the Teamsters supporting President Trump. So she has a real problem on her hands. That's the real gender gap issue in this race. As for President Trump's message to women, he speaks about the issues that women care about every single day. We care about prosperity for ourselves and our families. We want more money in our pockets. We don't want to go to the grocery store and face prices that are 25% higher today under Kamala Harris than they were under President Trump. So women want affordability. Women also want law and order in our communities. And Kamala Harris has supported weak on crime, defund the police, open border policies that have allowed illegal immigrant criminals into the country. In fact, there are more than 500,000 convicted criminal illegal aliens in the country right now. Kamala Harris has no plan to do anything with them. In sanctuary cities, we're seeing them commit more crimes and then they're let off free. And that's every woman's worst nightmare. We've seen tragedies happen to women in this country. Laken Riley in Georgia, Rachel Morin in Maryland, Jocelyn Nungare in Texas. Just a few names of innocent women who were brutally killed at the hands of illegal people who Kamala Harris led into this country. President Trump is offering a message of border security and law and order, and that's a very appealing message to women. I can say as a woman myself and as a new mother, we want a president who is going to protect our country and make our lives more affordable and offer the American dream to future generations.
Caroline, just something that's seemingly breaking at the moment in relation to the former president's comment at a rally yesterday, where he talked about protecting women whether they want it or not. Apparently, Vice President Harris is speaking to reporters in Wisconsin, and she says, and I quote, "It actually is very offensive to women to say that." What's your response to that?
I think that's an objective opinion from one woman. The women that I talk to, myself included, and the thousands and thousands of women that we see show up at President Trump's rallies in every state across the country, wherever he goes, want a leader who is going to protect them, want a president who is going to secure our country's borders, want a president who is going to stand up for the law enforcement and our communities rather than disparage them and defund them. They don't want a leader like Kamala Harris who has supported bailing out violent criminals from jail. Kamala Harris herself contributed to bail funds for violent criminals. Kamala Harris allowed illegal immigrant rapists and murderers to come into our border who have taken the lives of women in this country. So So I think it's Kamala Harris playing politics. Maybe she should listen to some of the women who have been impacted by her policies, like the families that I mentioned earlier. She has never reached out to them. You know who else she hasn't reached out to is the Gold Star moms who have lost their children because of Kamala Harris's weak foreign policy overseas. The Gold Star families from Abbygate, the Abbygate 13, as they now have to be called, because they lost their children because of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's incompetence. Kamala Harris has never reached out to these mothers who will never be the same because they lost their children in Afghanistan because of she and Joe Biden's incompetence. So maybe she should actually talk to women across the country and see what they want in a real leader.
One of the issues that our viewers really care about is the entrenched bureaucracy and sort of this perceived elite class of federal workers who are making policy on behalf of the American people despite being unelected. One of my criticisms from a conservative perspective of the first Trump term was I don't think he did enough to root out the quote-unquote deep state. In a second term, what is his plan to ensure that unelected bureaucrats are not in these major policy-making positions with the ability to essentially write the rules for the rest of us despite not being held accountable? Is he planning on using Schedule F revisions, for example, to root out civil servants?
Well, that is one of the top priorities of President Trump, is to root out the bureaucracy, to make our government more efficient, and to ensure that we don't have people who have been entrenched in Washington, D.C. for decades that are not actually doing their jobs and are ripping off the taxpayers on a taxpayer-funded government salary. So he will get to work on that immediately. And as I said previously, Elon Musk will be heading up the Government Efficiency Task Force, and will be looking at the bureaucracy as a whole and looking at where we can cut back to not only save money from taxpayers, but actually to get work done that benefits the American people and supports President Trump's agenda that he's running on and will win on, and therefore has a mandate from the American people to implement that agenda.
All right, Caroline Levitt, spokesperson for the Trump campaign. We appreciate you coming on, taking some challenging questions. We'll have to have you back. We have a lot more to cover on Rising right after this.
Some critics of President Biden fear that he won't just stop with the pardoning of his son, Hunter. Mainstream media has reported that Team Biden is considering preemptive pardons for people like Anthony Fauci and former Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
On the pardoning of Hunter, supporters of the president said that he just did what any man would do for his son. Independent journalist Matt Taibbi has some thoughts about that explanation. And here to elaborate is Matt Taibbi himself. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's just sort of summarize what your argument is about this. You're not a big believer in the paternal care explanation for this pardon, evidently.
Well, I mean, I'm actually a big believer in the presidential pardon power generally. I think the intent of it, if you go back and look at the Federalist Papers, was to provide a check against institutional power. And look, voters know that they're giving presidents this authority when they vote them in. And it's one of the things that we expect, that there's going to be this kind of thing at the end of a presidency often. And we've seen that in my lifetime, certainly. But the Hunter Biden pardon is a little bit different because it's cutting off an investigation that may have led to some other very interesting places, which is why the next problem of the rumored preemptive pardons of a whole range of people, as you mentioned, that might be much more problematic.
Yeah, I like that you bring that point up. I've mentioned that a couple times. You know, while I'm extremely critical of the actions Biden has taken here, not so much with the pardoning Hunter for the gun charge, but for exactly as you said, closing the door to a future investigation of corruption or influence peddling. I still wouldn't want the power limited because, you know, I want people like Ross Ulbricht and a pardon for Julian Assange, a freeing Ross Ulbricht, you know, political kind of people who've been mistreated, and if you subjected the pardon power to additional scrutiny or approval from, you know, more, I don't know, establishment members of elected office, there's no way that your Chelsea Mannings, your Edward Snowdens, they wouldn't even, I mean, right now it's already difficult. They wouldn't have a snowball's chance in hell of getting pardons if you had anybody else involved in the process. So while I don't like this, I wouldn't tweak the power for that reason. You know, what is, you've written so much about Russiagate and, you know, the national security states' interventions into media narratives around these things. What do you see as being lost if we're no longer going to be looking at any of the Hunter Biden stuff with Ukraine, et cetera?
Well, that's not a story that I know a ton about. I mean, we did some work on the whistleblowers that were behind in the IRS and who were commenting on the FBI investigation and where that was leading and not leading. My understanding is that there was a whole range of shell companies that that would have been looked at going forward. Not just Rosemont Seneca, right, which is the famous one that people know about, but there are others that need to be looked at, I think, because there is significant suspicion of wide-scale influence peddling. So that's disappointing. But I think it will be even more dangerous if they cut off investigations into, say, the origins of Russiagate or things like the origin of COVID or the government's response to COVID. There's a whole rat's nest of stuff that I don't think the country can afford to see preempted by a wave of pardons. And by the way, I agree with you about the pardon power. If it wasn't just invested in a single person, if they had to create another committee, that's the whole problem. Is that these institutions, they're impregnable. Once you get an institution involved, that's when you get somebody who stays in prison for life, and that's why you need it to be in the hands of a single person, theoretically. So I'm not in favor of cutting back the authority. It's just that in this case, it doesn't look great.
In relation to the preemptive pardons, Matt, I mean, it seems like basically a large part of your concern is the idea that if those pardons were indeed issued, it would choke off investigations that would be worthy investigations in your mind, if I have that correct. So that is true across a range of issues, across a range of the names who have been mentioned as potential preemptive pardonees, if that's the correct phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the names that they're talking about include Senator-elect Adam Schiff. He was prominently mentioned in the Politico piece that was floated out there not by, conservatives or critics of Joe Biden, but clearly they came from congressional Democrats, the sources in that story were. So they're floating the idea, it seems. And the three names that were mentioned were Anthony Fauci, Liz Cheney, and Adam Schiff. And that right there, you see represented three major avenues of investigation. One is Russiagate, the other is COVID, and the third is the J6 investigation, which Donald Trump has talked about being interested in. I know less about that one. The other two, though, I know there would be significant interest in going in a wide variety of directions, not just on the part of Congress, but also the incoming executive branch enforcement agencies. They are rearing to go and look at some of those issues. And if there are pardons of some of the key figures, that will be very difficult for them going forward.
The mainstream media and Democrats and allies of President Biden are defending this by describing what President Trump might do when he gets into office, is settling scores with enemies. Kash Patel, who's nominee to head the FBI, has in the past said things about going after enemies in, not just political figures, but also in the media. I don't want to see that kind of thing happen. I don't want to see just score settling because you disagreed with President Trump or you criticized him. Certainly don't want to see the government going after the media. That's everything I'm against. At the same time, that I don't want to see. Bad, not legitimate. But, investigating political figures who did, or government figures who did wrong or who misled the American people or were corrupt or that kind of thing. Well, yes, we want that investigated by our government. What is your level of hope that we're going to see from like a Kash Patel, the kinds of investigations or reforms that probably you and I would want to see rather than the ones that establishment figures fear we're going to get?
Well, I understand that concern. And like you, I reflexively recoil when I hear anybody talking about going after the media because normally, I would say in 99.99% of cases, that's usually an illegitimate thing to be looking in the direction of. There are rare instances where journalists can technically be in violation of the law for reporting things, and President Barack Obama actually broke the seal on those kinds of investigations by launching 8 different Espionage Act cases that went after leakers in media cases. And one of those involved a media figure who was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. That was James Rosen at Fox, or Rosen, I'm sorry. And I do worry about that, however. One thing I will say, though, is that Russiagate is an extremely unusual case where there's a lot of the stuff that took place could not have happened without the media. And there may be some situations where there were media figures who weren't exactly acting in the traditional way that we would expect a journalist to act. In other words, just reporting on stories that were handed to them. Some of the things that Kash Patel was looking at, for instance, involved illegal leaks that were handed over to media figures that kept maybe an improper investigation alive going forward. Now, again, normally I think the journalist is innocent in that case. As long as they're just reporting on what happened, that's fine. But there may be some civil issues if they knowingly printed something they knew to be untrue. And he's said that, I haven't sorted out yet whether that's going to be civil or criminal. So I'm hopeful on that score. Also, we do still have the justice system to protect us against overreach if they are going to go in that direction. And I would hope that they're not going to go in that direction, because that would be a huge political loss for them if they did.
Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Robbie. Neil.